So before we start, I do have a second channel. So if you are interested in more content that isn't related to anime and manga, consider going over there and subscribing. Also, if you end up enjoying this video, consider leaving a like. I'd greatly appreciate it. So over the past couple of days, I've been within thought about a very specific character within Jujutsu Kaisen, and that is none other than Megumi Fushiguro. And there's kind of a good reason for this. When I look at Megumi, I see someone that is very significant to the overall architecture that is Kaisen's narrative, in terms of where he sits as an individual, the contrast and the dynamic between other characters, his emotions, his mentality, and overall the general importance that he plays throughout the story. The weird thing about it for myself is that he gets backseated quite a lot. So while he is definitely a part of the main cast of characters, the amount of focus or attention on him sometimes can be very little in a very broad sense. What do I mean by this? Well, you may see Megumi often throughout chapters. You may see him supplying very intelligent amount of information or just deciphering something in a very specific way. You may see him be very battle hardened and very intelligent in that regard and how he approaches different battles. But when it comes down to the more semantics or the specifics of his mentality, his thought process, we cut away from him sometimes very quickly. This isn't a fault by any means on Akutami's front. This is very specific in design, and today I kind of want to pull it apart a little bit more. I want to paint a bit more of a kind of traumatizing, tragic picture for his childhood, for his past, maybe the stuff that he's experienced. The reason I want to do this is because it's not really meant to be interpreted this way. So while Akutami kind of gives you the options to go down this path in terms of a thought process regarding Megumi's mentality, his emotions, his mental health, and his childhood/trauma specifically, it's not something that you have to do. I personally think it just makes for a very interesting conversation, and whether it's believable or not is obviously entirely up to you. So with that being said, let's begin. First and foremost, I want to clarify that I actually really enjoy Megumi as a character. I think he's very interesting. He's straightforward, he's super simplistic in the grand scheme of things, but I love that simplicity. I think he brings this genuine point of contact where a lot of other characters may feel kind of confused or caught up within the moment. Megumi always seems very precise with what he wants to do, not only within the approach in terms of thought, but his action, his consequences. He's willing to go the full length in very dire situations. When you're writing a character like this, like Megumi Fushiguro, you may think it's pretty easy. There's nothing all too difficult about him. He's very straightforward in that aspect, but there is a lot of kind of hidden hurdles that come with approaching a character like this, and the difficulties start to stack up on themselves. And if you aren't paying attention to this character, if you aren't aware of those difficulties or those hurdles, you can be bombarded very quickly. I think a big one to point out, for an example, is if you do not pay enough attention to a character like Megumi with the architecture that they uphold, they will get left behind very quickly. And you can kind of notice that with Megumi, his point of development are very small and infrequent compared to a lot of other characters. Look at Yuji, for example, who is kind of the main spotlighted character of our story. Thus, we obviously get a lot of information and a lot of development and growth through him. But when you also kind of take into consideration Nobara as well, they all kind of traverse at different speeds, which is completely understandable, but Megumi is the one that lags behind rather heavily. And this is genuinely on purpose. So you don't see all too much of the mental or even power growth within the story until basically the time is right. You can see it creep, however, it's always kind of there, but it's not there. You never take that final step into it, and that comes with that self-sacrificial mindset that's throughout the entirety of Kaisen, which I truly appreciate. It's kind of become a meme at this point, but it's something that Akutami has done to kind of plant the seeds for his growth or for his development in both the power structure and his mental health, or his mentality, basically. Every fight that he gets into, he is willing to sacrifice himself to try and spawn the Mahoraga, or some sort of domain expansion, which he knows he is not capable of doing successfully. So it's going to take a massive toll on his body, on his health, and potentially even kill him. That mindset is very impressive, it's very scary, but it's also very important, because I feel like it comes from a place that we haven't really seen all too much of in terms of his childhood. Why does he think this way? Why does he kind of care so much about everyone else but himself, to the point that he's willing to sacrifice himself when he faces a bit of an uphill battle? He's definitely kind of putting it lightly, but he does this within every single fight. That's not to say that he's suicidal, but more so willing to do absolutely everything within his power to save the people that he feels is worth saving. And I should clarify, the people that he feels is worth saving is something that is valued very differently for each individual. It's not a universal thing, kind of more so comes into contact with people that he values, and it changes or evolves over time. So Nobara and Yuji specifically is someone that he becomes very close to. They change him rather heavily. He becomes a lot more open, a lot more confident within himself even, and he grows alongside them. He appreciates them. When I think about this and kind of take it back to his childhood, I imagine this is something that he has never had before. The reason why he values different people in specific ways, and while it's not a universal kind of morality thing, it's more of a personality thing. Something that stems from potential trauma and childhood issues, not only contributed to the passing of his parental figures, but also the political kind of power dynamic of the Jujutsu sorcery world. What do I mean by this? Well, let's take a look at his childhood, for example. We only know bits and pieces of the information. His father, Toji, is someone that was feared rather heavily. However, there was a point prior to Toji being feared where he was quote-unquote normal. I don't know for how long, but supposedly he was still kind of uncaring or unforgiving when it comes to the political semantics of the sorcery world and the clans specifically, meaning that he didn't really care, to the point where he would go out and most likely fell in love with someone that either wasn't part of the family or wasn't part of the main line of the family, which would be Megumi's mother. And then you also have the variation of Megumi's sister having a different mother entirely. From my knowledge, which is a little bit loose at the moment, I don't think we know the specifics of those relationships, if that makes sense, regarding Megumi's mother and his sister's mother and how Toji kind of maneuvered between those relationships. But we do know that the death of Toji's partner, his wife, kind of sent him down this spiral of insanity. It made him the very vicious and scary monster that we have all come to love. This is a scary mindset to kind of be put within, and because of this, it has kind of portrayed Toji in this very negligent fatherly role, when in reality it's definitely more so tragic that it has been taken from him. The political side of the sorcery world has shunned him in every single regard, and it has fallen down this route of something very saddening. This has a very massive toll on children, and Megumi would have been very young when this happened. Not only when Toji went out of control, but when they both disappeared, when they both vanished in front of his eyes, basically. I think this alone is enough to easily create development difficulties within children, especially at a younger age. And you can kind of see that hollowed husk or the emotional fortitude wall that kind of comes up over Megumi as a child. The first time he meets Gojo, for example, he is kind of lifeless. He doesn't have the nature of a child. He seems way too mature for his age, and it's most likely because he's experienced things far beyond what his childlike brain could even comprehend. Thus, it kind of retroactively stunts your development and growth, but also forces you to grow up way too quickly. And once again, you face very odd placed kind of hurdles that are very mentally and emotionally taxing. You don't really know how to decipher these feelings. You don't know how to talk about them. You don't know how to approach it yourself. So instead, you kind of push away from it, and because of that, you become potentially a lot more hollow. You lose this empathy. You lose this morality, per se. Funny enough, this is all the things that are betrayed through Megumi at a much later date. When he is older, a lot of it has transferred over, and I do think the sorcery world is not the best place for children. We've seen just how odd the higher-ups can be. We've seen just how specific the families are. We know as a sheer fact that the Zenin family has the most outdated and disgusting kind of perception conception of raising their children, especially when it comes to gender, when it comes to power, when it comes to the mindset of them. They will create soldiers before anything, powerful people, and that's what they value. Luckily, Megumi was never a part of that, but we've seen that reflected through Maki, and look how far she's come as a character. She has created her own identity, and it's come at a very big loss, a very sacrificial loss, but one that has propped her up very high and has allowed her to bloom her wings to be the powerful woman that she is in her own regard, not within the shadow of the Zenin family, but herself. Megumi has taken a different approach. Obviously, he was taken by Gojo and raised kind of independently, I believe. We don't really know by who, but you can imagine just kind of the displacement of homes being a little bit odd, and how that would also refuel back into the kind of abandonment issues and the creeping trauma that comes from the loss of his parents, and how he emotionally couldn't really handle that. And then you have a very somewhat early introduction into the sorcery world. We do know that Megumi went to a normal school, but at this point he already knew about his abilities thanks to Gojo and thanks to being within the sorcery world, yet he still tried to live a somewhat normal life and obviously couldn't fit in. He would kind of get into very massive altercations where he would take on big pockets of the school's bullies to completely obliterate them. Now this was very noble and obviously morally driven, because there was no reason for him to do this other than him potentially saving someone or stopping someone else from getting bullied, so he would go out of his way to do it. But his overall attention to it seemed very null and void, almost like he didn't care that he was within this position of power. He didn't care that he overtowered everyone else, thus he didn't care about the consequences that came with beating them up. So while he's definitely done something good and for the sake of other people, which is kind of his whole mindset, he never truly quantifies the consequences of not only himself, but the surrounding people. The reason why he's willing to go this far, the reason why he doesn't care about any of the issues or problems that it may give birth to or may even come from it. I'd like to take this moment to say that I know a lot of this may seem overwhelming. The story and Akatami do not really give you the reins to interpret it this way. They give you slight bits and pieces, a little bit of crumbs here and there, but nothing to truly dive down this path of his childhood being so trauma driven with the loss of his parents and being taken away from his home and joining the sorcery world at a young age and having it all conflicted and kind of jumbled up and boiled all over the place, mixed with the fact that he's never mentally or emotionally or even spiritually grieved or kind of even understood the process of losing both of his parents. You mix that with the politics of his original family, which is the Zenin bloodline, mixed with the politics of other families and the sorcery world in itself, and you have just a very confused child that is way too young, that has experienced way too many things. This is something that the story doesn't give you in all too much detail, but admittedly it is fun to kind of interpret it this way and kind of create that picture yourself if obviously it is of interest. The reason I mention all of this though, and why I'm so curious about his past and his childhood, is where he is currently now. Obviously he has grown a lot. We've seen it. We've experienced it. He's summoned Maharaga without dying. He almost did, but he recognized for once that this is a consequence that he's willing to accept, and the time felt right. Prior to those times, everything else other than the domain was more of a first response type of thing, that he would instantly go to that without any sort of afterthought for what may happen, whereas the domain and the summoning of Maharaga actually had a lot of thought process within it, and it comes with like a secondary roadblock, which is acceptance. The prior ones did not have that acceptance. So we've seen two very extremely powerful abilities come out from Megumi. How is this going to be amplified within the Culling games? See, personally, we are in an arc that is so perfectly built around Megumi to show him in all of his glorious fashion, from his mind, his emotions, his mentality, his abilities, his character in and out. And it's because that the biggest reason we are within this arc to begin with is because of Megumi's sister, the one individual that he deeply cares about through and through. So most likely we will see him be pushed to his limits in all of those facets that I've mentioned, in some of the most detailed ways that we have yet to experience. And in some of the more recent chapters, you can actually see that mentality starting to get pushed to his limits. He is taking this obviously extremely seriously. seriously. He's not beating around the bush. He's not trying to deal with people trying to play this game in the most efficient or smartest way possible. He knows what he wants. He knows what he's willing to do to achieve it, and he is not taking anyone's kind of mental gymnastics at face value. He will kind of carve his path through them if needed. So it's slowly ramping or building up to kind of break his character apart and to show it in every aspect possible. So within that train of thought, you probably could see him kind of using his domain once again, and potentially even Maharaga. The second option is a little bit kind of last resorty because it's still very difficult for him to do, but impressive nonetheless. But definitely his domain. I would love to see kind of the push within these fights to see him develop and hone his domain once again, because it was very incomplete the first time he used it. But now that we're getting into a more serious consequence-driven situation that he obviously cares about very deeply in terms of his sister, that domain will be pushed to its limit and will either be perfected or completely evolve into something else entirely. These abilities come with the mental backing, and I know that you're probably sick of me mentioning the mental aspect of this character, but for me it's very important, and I'm very interested to see how the mechanics of it work. Once again, within the recent stuff, you can see it turning and trickling over, and how he interprets characters, how he views them, and what emotion that he chooses to show towards them. He's very kind of aggressive in the sense now where he wants to cut through everyone and just find his sister as quick as possible. So when or if she is most likely in danger within the Culling games later on, you will most likely see a side of this character, Megumi Fushiguro, that we have never seen before. Someone with so much purpose, with so much intent, with so much aggression, with so much portrayal of emotion that is pouring outside of them, which will most likely reflected within his abilities such as his domain expansion, or kind of more finesse or control of Maharaga. Do you see how they go hand in hand in that regard? Who knows, if we're really lucky, we might be able to see a little bit of a flashback for his childhood and how that's treated him, because we see him self-reflect on his own mental state quite often and is able, at least at this point, to recognize specific things that he knows isn't really healthy for himself, yet to be able to change them or rectify the problem is easier said than done. It's something that comes with time, and that's where that healing point with Yuji and Nobara and even Gojo specifically comes into play. That all of these other people help uplift him and to help him recognize potentially his own problems, his own issues that he may be facing, or his own trauma that may be hidden underneath. Whether or not we get any sort of correlation to those things, I'm not entirely sure, but for one thing I am certain about, the Culling games and Megumi go hand in hand. The showcase of his character is going to be nothing but beautiful. It's going to be incredible. It's going to be amazing. And we've already seen the opening fireworks for it. The main event, the main course, is going to be phenomenal. And I, for one, couldn't be more than excited to see how far this character is going to go. Endtime. So welcome to the end of the video. If you have made it this far, I appreciate you immensely. Thank you. I would, however, like to know how you feel about Megumi Fushiguro as a character. How do you feel about his mentality, his abilities, his future, potentially even his childhood? And where do you think the Culling games is going to put him? Do you think we're going to get a very glorious showcase of who he is as a character? Definitely let me know down below. With that, however, I want to thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Leave a like and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. Drink plenty of water, and I will see you within the next one. Goodbye.